Hello, Megas, and anybody else who's listening out there. Welcome to the latest edition of the Meg podcast. This episode, in addition to the usual suspects of Richard Jeffrey Cook and Matt Haywood, we have guests. Yes, multiple guests. So not one, in fact, 3 guests. So I'd like everybody to welcome Paul Cummins, Graham Clacker, and Paul Stovall.
Hi. Hi, guys.
So thank you very much for joining us. And of course, thank you to Matt and Richard for continuing to put up with my endless drivel and waffling on at the start of these. Okay, in this episode, we're going to have a look back at the recent God Wills It Crusades-ish themed event, which was run at Battlefield Hobbies. So obviously, big thank you to Battlefield Hobbies for all their assistance and hospitality as usual. Hoping that what I will call the panel will give us their pearls of wisdom on things like their army choice, what they were thinking or not thinking about their armies, how the armies did, and things like that. So hopefully it will give you, the listeners, some insights into how the guys here designed their armies within the context of this theme. For good or ill, I couldn't make it, so you're going to be excused me talking about my army choice. I'm only going to ask the panel here to go through theirs. Not a lot of point in talking about an army that didn't complete. So you're missing my fevered ramblings this time. You'll be very glad to hear. So I think without further ado, we'll dive in. As I said, God Wills It was Crusades-ish themed. It didn't just include the Holy Land. It also included Eastern Europe, Africa, and Spain for the Reconquista. Armies from a number of the PDFs, Crusades, Reconquista. My mind is going because I completely forgot to write it down.
I think Ostsiedlung was one.
Ostsiedlung was one, and then some specific ones from Franca Crater and
House of Osman.
House of Osman. Thank you. See, I didn't go, so I've not planned ahead now. So I just thought I would just ask the guys here first what they thought of the mix of armies that was taken at the event. I list checked, and one thing that jumped out at me was, well, a couple of things, that there were 5 later Crusaders were taken. Really not very many of the Muslim type armies, a couple of Ottomans, and that was more or less it really. And then apart from 3 Almoravids. So guys, what did you think of the mix, and any particular thoughts on those particular cases? I don't know. Paul, say something. Paul Cummins, let's start with you.
Well, okay. Late Crusaders are a real beast of an army, so it's always a good choice. And then you sort of got to try and come up with something opposite it. So actually, the oddity is that the last time there was a Crusades theme, the Islamic armies absolutely trounced the Christian armies. So I was quite surprised. I wonder whether it's a reaction to the last comp that was Foot Sloggers. So LB's tried to get as much mounted as they can and do something different to what they did before. But that doesn't explain the lack of Islamic armies, unless, of course, we go with the best Islamic armies are the ones that did turn up with the long spear, which are also going to be good against the later Crusader, which is an obvious choice. So that's not surprising to me that there was that many or that few shooty cavalry Arabic armies.
Can I say I was caught out because I expected there would be some shooty Arabic armies, and had selected my army accordingly. So I wasn't over impressed by other people's choices when it came to looking at my prospects, but that was certainly my surprise, indeed.
Yeah, I thought from an early player using shooty cavalry, it's quite intimidating, potentially having to deal with lots of charging lancers. It's a little bit harder work than it is when there's lots of infantry, so it does make shooty cavalry armies a bit harder to use, I guess. If not more effective, but Didn't stop me, mind you, but
It didn't stop me either, to be perfectly honest. I knew there were going to be a load of Crusader armies, and I still took what I took. So, you can judge my foolishness as you will.
I'm in Richard's camp. I was expecting it to follow Cross and Crescent and be lots of Arab armies. My choice was Hobson's choice, really. I needed to pick an Islamic army, really, because that's what I had the choice for. I did briefly consider El Cid, and I think that might illuminate the change in emphasis. If I remember correctly, there was a 1150-ish cutoff for Cross and Crescent, or certainly before the vast bulk of the knights were going to be fully armored. And I think probably the advent of fully armoredness has certainly, if you're an Arab using a long spear on a horseback, you go from this is really quite I'm really quite strong here to oh no, actually I'm not.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think you're right. There was a cut-off at Cross and Crescent that meant there were very restricted numbers of fully armoured knights available, and also I suppose the later Crusaders wouldn't have been able to have those mixed infantry formations, spear and crossbow as well.
Yeah, that was the other thing I was going to say. I think anything that can fight and shoot on foot is really good value. So it can twice as many dice, pretty much. And that's pretty much the only units in that theme that could really do that. So that jumped that up quite high.
Yeah, so. But I must admit, I was still surprised there weren't a couple more of the shooty cavalry Muslim armies. Although I think a couple of the Crusaders had Syrian allies, which had 3 units of Mamluks, so sort of Crusaders with some shooty cavalry.
yeah, fought 2 of those.
The army I would have fought with was somewhat along those lines as well. Although, okay, I said I wasn't going to talk about my army. I will say one thing. My army would have had a unit. It would have been Lusignan Cypriot with Mamluk allies, and the Mamluk ally would have had the armoured horse Royal Mamluks in there.
Ooh.
And my thinking was there'll be enough shooty cavalry out there to make it worthwhile. So I mean, I thought it was interesting that there weren't so many of the Muslims, but GK and Matt, I'm sure, will tell us why they did take shooty Muslim armies as we go through this podcast. I would also just note because it cropped up in our last podcast, and Matt and Richard might be join me feeling slightly smug about this. The Black Army Hungarian was taken by Richard Basilowski. Apologies, Richard, if that mangles your surname. We suggested at the last podcast that it wasn't the greatest army on earth, and Richard, I think, proved it. Coming last, has anybody had any further thoughts on that Black Army since our last podcast, or has Richard's performance at God Wills It just confirmed everybody's thoughts?
I still like it as an army, but then I wouldn't use it the way Richard was using it. The main reason for having it for me was the Hussars, or the Gazars. So Gazars, a couple of war wagons, and some Secklers. I think it's quite a nice setup, something to dance around and hide behind. But you sort of can do pretty much everything you want to do with the Hungarians with the later Polish, apart from the knights are not quite so good in the later Polish.
Okay.
And I think, to be fair to Richard, he didn't actually lose many games. He just didn't win many games. If you see what I mean.
Fair enough. I've only seen sort of the raw score at the end of it. So
Yeah, I think only Lee actually conceded less points than Richard. I think he lost 1 and had 3 very low scoring games.
Yeah, I think we did say it was quite a hard army to use.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But he did win the wooden spoon, which I think was one of his major reasons for going. So
Something I've never done, and I consider it a blight on my wargaming CV.
Oh, I have a few.
It was an outstanding spoon, I must say. It was
So-
outstanding.
Will was well up to his usual efforts in producing an excellent wooden spoon.
Yeah, we all appreciate Will's contributions on that. Okay, so not to belabor this anymore, I think we should move on to your individual armies, guys. And I don't know, who shall I pick to start with? Mr. Clacker, on the grounds he was. If you could give us some ideas on why you took the army, you're thinking about it, and so on and so forth.
Well, I went with the Ottoman Turks. It was purely a sentimental reason, to be honest. When me and my dad started playing Meg last year, we went through a lot of the old figures that were left overs, and the one sort of complete army we had was an Ottoman Turk army. He's also the same figures that my mum got to the Nationals final with about 30 years ago in WRG Renaissance. She did use them obviously somewhat better than I did. So yeah, I decided for a long time I ought to use an Ottoman Turkish army, and looking at the theme, I've just been learning a bit about the Ottomans as well and listening about the Crusade in Acropolis, so I thought I ought to take one. So that was the reasoning behind it. I only had 12 Janissaries available, and I couldn't really see how to make the list work without 2 full blocks of 8. I thought they'd be a bit hard to support them, particularly with lots of charging lancers. So I decided to take the maximum number of Serbian knights and then pick the rest of it as kind of a shooty cavalry army, and try and use it that way. So I picked the maximum number of the Kingsley skirmishers. So four blocks of 6. 3 of them were Cantabrian. I picked the 3 units of Serbian knights. So 1 unit of 4 Superior, who are fully armored, charging lancer, devastating charge, and melee expert. A unit of 6, which are the same but average, and then another unit of 6, which are average protected, charging lancer, dev charge, and melee expert. I later found out you can actually mix those two up, but I missed that bit in the rule, so I had different units, for better or for worse. And then the compulsory Azab archers, who I downgraded and took everything away. They were poor, unprotected, unskilled bows, so they weren't allowed any arrows. And I deployed them as far in a corner as I possibly could to make it as far away from my camp, to make them not a very enticing target, and also to take away the temptation of me actually moving them, which is always a bad thing. And then I picked just 4 units of 4 protected cavalry. I had 2 lots of the best Sipai, I think it's called. So superior protected experienced bow, short spear. I had 2 blocks of 4 of those. I had 2 blocks of 4 of the average protected experienced bow, short spear, and I had 1 unit of Crimean Tatars, who are form flexible average protected experienced bow, and that just gave me an extra scouting point rather than taking a unit of Sipai. So the plan was to have a tug which could work alongside one of the Sugs. I had 14 cards, so 3 competent professional generals for the Turks and 1 talented instinctive ally. And the plan was just to try and white dice at death, use the Cantabrian horse archers to give me some green dice, and hopefully insert the charging lancers at the right time. But it was quite difficult. It's a lot harder using a shooty cavalry army when you've got something that doesn't evade. So you've got to time the insertion of your knights correctly. But that was the thinking behind it.
So
yeah.
Did the plan survive contact with the enemy?
Yes and no, I think is the answer. To be honest, I set out one of the games as a buy, and the other 3 I played 2 later Crusader lists, and I was in the game for most of them. I lost 15-10 the first one. I think it was 15-6 the second one, and I was in the game for both games. Probably a little bit lucky in the first one. Really, I won where I really didn't think I was going to win at all, and where I thought I was going to win, I didn't. as a classic cases. Couple of moments where I didn't. You tried to get your angle. I tried to do some clever things and didn't get them quite right. The third game, I was particularly pleased with the way I played, but actually lost that one 15-4, as often the way is. I tried to do some clever angling, so my skirmishes broke one way or another, and it was a combination of not being quite precise enough to rescue the bad skirmish dice. I decided to run away 3 times and rolling a 2 1s and a 2, meaning I had 3 units of protected cavalry who got hit in the rear by charging lancers, giving away 8 factors.
Ouch.
Ouch.
Yeah, I did. In fact, there's a few times I've seen a shatter on the first dice. Oh, well, you'll be 10 up then. Yeah, so difficult to use. I thought it was going to be tricky against the knights. Certainly got slightly put off by 2 armies with 3 lots of 6 Mamelukes, which were very disturbing for my lesser shooty cavalry as they were in this case. But yeah, it worked all right, but it was difficult. I was really happy with 3 games that were competitive and interesting. So I'm not sure it's a list I would take normally, but it was better than I initially thought it was going to be honest.
Anyone got any thoughts?
My experience with that sort of army is figuring out when and where to commit the knights. That's something I've got wrong in the past. So I commend you for your use of it. But yes, it was the sort of army I was hoping to face with mine, to be truthful. I never did.
Do you think if you could have got some Janissaries in there, it would have improved it?
Well, it's the same with everything. You've got to lose something to get them in, don't you? My concern with the Janissaries was they didn't have anything to work with. They'd have been potentially a little bit left on their own. I didn't have anything else to anchor them with. So if you put 2 blocks of 8 Janissaries in, it will look a very different list, as I suspect we will find out shortly. I guess because I didn't have the Janissaries, it means I probably wasn't Bayezid. I was probably one of his sub commanders on the flank, who was who lost. So that's fair enough, I guess. Yeah, it's a good learning list as well, trying to do something slightly different with the mixture of knights and stuff. So there are probably better shooty horse archer armies out there. So if you're gonna, I have since acquired 4 more Janissaries. So if I do the Ottoman Turks again, I shall probably do something different. But,
Yeah, I'd certainly agree with Richard's comment, having used armies with shooty cavalry and some knights in as well, or similar cavalry. The timing of when to put the knights in is very important. I always find I'm wanting to push them forward earlier than they probably should be. Paul, I don't know if you've had experience with that.
I tend to do the same. Yeah, I end up shoving my knights somewhere really painful really early because I get carried away, which is actually part of why my list was the shape it was in the end, because I kept losing the knights in heroic fashion, which is of course how knights need to go. But really, you want to save them for the counterattack, not the blast at the beginning.
Yeah. I'll leave Matt's comments to his list because he also took an Ottoman. So I don't know, Paul S., if you've got any thoughts
on the Ottomans.
Yeah, on Graham's Ottoman.
I think on Graham's list, I think once you've made the decision to go with maximum Serbs, the list is probably fairly restrained or constrained, I should say. I'm not sure what else you could do with it. It certainly gave me a fairly hard time practice game. So
yeah, I mean you are committing most of 3,000 points plus the general. Yes, you're probably 3,000 points of your 10,000 into the Serbs, aren't you?
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you, Graham. Let's move on to Paul S. Who for those who don't know, did extremely well at the competition. You placed second, didn't you, Paul?
I did.
In the end, So behind Lee Sanders, who won all 4 of his games. So Paul, you used Almoravid in Spain, which again harks back to a previous podcast of ours, doesn't it?
Indeed, you can take credit for me choosing the Spanish Open. So Nick, I was inspired by your podcast to do so, although not entirely by the podcast. The practice game I played against Graham's Ottomans, I did in fact have a unit of 4 Christian knights, who came off second best to a unit of Spahai, and it got me thinking that my army was just a little bit skimpy in terms of frontage. Because you've got go into a little bit in the list. If you're going to pick a Moravid, you're going to end up with the Blackguard and 2 units of long spear, superior long spear. You could have 3 units of 6, but I think 2 units of 8 is the widely regarded best pick.
Yeah,
and that again is a good over 3,000 points of your list before you've gone another 2,500, 3,000 on commanders, and there's not an awful lot left. If you then spend another 1,500 points, another unit of good troops, there really is very little less left to pick. So, having abandoned the knights, I abandoned the Christian crossbowmen as well, and decided to go and fight in Spain. As I say, I think the list once you've picked those 3 units, you've got 2 units of compulsory tribal short spear shield wall. You've got 2 units of compulsory Berber horse, who are javelins, skirmishers who can't have Cantabrian. And once you've added all that up, there's not an awful lot left. I went with a unit of the aforementioned arrowless archers, poor, inexperienced bow, a unit of 6 that used to try to find somewhere safe-ish to sit and do nothing for the game. I'm quite taken with Graham's idea of putting it out of command, so you're not tempted to use it. I didn't actually do that, but I think it's quite a good wheeze. What I did do, though, is I quite often had a command that I thought was going to be putting its general at risk. And so I would add the archers, even if they were miles away on the other side of the battlefield, to his command, so that if he ever did happen to die, and all his other troops were dead, I'd still get his cards to play with, because he could go and join the archers. Or rather, he wouldn't disappear because he had no troops left in his command.
Yeah, no, that sounds a very good idea. And I suppose for newer players, just a rules point there, that if your general is killed, and also all the units that have been allocated to his command are destroyed, he doesn't come back, so you'll lose all the cards for that command for the rest of the game. So, having a unit that's miles away from any action that he can pop back to, even if he then does pretty much nothing, you've got the flexibility to at least discard cards and have some flexibility that way. So I think it's a really good point between the 2 of you there, Paul and Graham.
Yeah.
As an aside to your side, just for a second there, what happens if you've got a floating CNC and he dies? He's got no troops in the first place. Is he gone?
CNC technically commands all troops in an army, doesn't he? He's in line of command.
It was a moment that struck me there for a second. Sorry, Paul.
No, actually, no, to throw this to Richard. I think Richard is better at these questions than I am.
I think that's correct. I think because the army commander technically commands all troops, my view would be that he can return to any unit in the army. It does, however, imply that for one turn you cannot dish out any cards because your floating commander won't be actually on table to do so. Yes, probably not the best thing to happen.
I guess if you had a couple of allies and you lost all the troops, all the core troops, he possibly wouldn't come back then.
I think by that stage, if you'd be pretty near breaking anyway, it'd be quite hard to construct an army. It's probably doable.
I'm tempted.
I can see both Paul and GK nodding here, going, "Oh, now there's a challenge." Paul's joining in now, and Matt's probably just writing an army list actually half of Matt's
Does Matt
army
not have one
probably
already?
work that way anyway.
Yeah, my army this weekend comes close to it because that has 2 allies. So the actual core army is less than half the total number of units.
Oh no, it's good. We're setting up a challenge for people. So who to blame for that one? Who knows? Sorry, Paul. We take me away from you.
Yes.
You were describing your army, but hopefully there's some
So
useful
just-
things in there for.
Just to recap it, then you've got 5 units of close infantry, the 2 superior spearmen, the exceptional blackguard, and the 2 units of Berbers, the 2 units of skirmishing light horse, and the really crummy unit of archers, and that left me with about 1,000 points up left at the end, which I went for a unit of sensible archers. Let's say I didn't unprotected, experienced bow, tribal. I made them 8 strong, and I refrained from making them combat shy. And their job was to intimidate shooty cavalry armies, of which, of course, there were very few. And that's about a bit over 400 points. And I spent the rest on 3 units of 6 skirmishing infantry, 2 bow and 1 sling, all average, unprotected, combat shy, which again were kind of insurance against shooting cavalry armies. And they actually did a pretty good job all tournament. I think I will be a champion of picking cheap skirmish infantry. I would argue certainly better in 6s for my army than in 9s. I think you need to give a bit of thought as to what you intend to use them for. But for essentially a close foot army, having a file of 2 skirmishers stuck between the blocks, it's quite difficult for the other guy to get at them, and 2 base width gap is quite difficult to insert something in to get a sneaky flank attack. They tend to protect each other, and so it almost gives you a natural spacing, which I found quite useful. It lets the list occupy more space than it would do otherwise, and which makes it a little bit more difficult for somebody to go and just hold you up on one end, because they're not holding up so many troops essentially. And of course, the skirmishers will shoot at whatever is trying to hold them up, which can be annoying, if nothing else.
I think you forgot the camels, Paul.
Oh, sorry, I have indeed forgotten the camels. So my last.
How could you forget the?
I know, madness to have forgotten the camels. So there's a unit of 6 tribal camels who are formed loose, average protected, short spear, devastating charge, melee experts.
Tribal, actually.
Tribal, yes, tribal. And tribal is a bit of a difficulty for them, it must be said. So they did tend to sit right at the back and await their moment. So they were quite like Graham's Serbs in that respect. They were helped on a couple of games where I got a fairly useful situated bit of brush, which meant they could walk into the brush and maneuver through that without anyone getting in their way.
Perhaps worth explaining that camels are not affected by brush, so gain all the benefits of being in good terrain. So camel armies tend to have a natural preference for brush terrain because they get the advantages of mounted against loose foot.
Does anybody use many camel armies like that? Because my thought would have been, if you just stick, my experience with terrain like that is that you put your camels in the terrain, they already quite like fighting cavalry anyway, so the other person's cavalry simply just won't go there. I don't know.
The usual thing I find is that people have learnt to stay away from the brush, so you can almost play on the fact that you know they're not going to put anything there, particularly if you outscout them. It's using terrain in the sense that it spooks the other person rather than necessarily expecting for the camels to actually fight in that terrain.
In one game I played, they had quite good fun by moving through the brush against the Crusader list, and my skirmishing javelin cavalry could then go out and play either side of them.
Yeah.
and that meant I didn't. Oh, so I have forgotten another unit. Oh dear, I'm not doing very well here. I also forgot my. I've also forgotten my Guz. There's a unit of Guz who are form flexible, unprotected, experienced bow, whose main job was to sit between the two units of Cantabrian javelin men and go into formed order when necessary to stop people trying to drive them off.
Absolutely, yeah. I have to say, I'm really intrigued, and I think it's a really cunning idea you had about you talked about earlier about having those skirmisher units between rather than in front of your infantry. You know, I think my instinct is always to put them in front, unless they're right out on the flanks or something. And I really like that idea, because especially for this Almoravid, because when fighting, I've always found it's narrow. So especially if I've got a shooty cavalry army, I'll think, well, I'll get round one flank or the other really quite easily, and cause it all sorts of problems. But that would extend it, and as you said, they shoot as well. So I'm well impressed by that.
Yeah, I varied it a little bit depending on opponent, and I also arranged my generals. I gave a bit of thought to. I had a professional, competent CNC, and I picked a talented professional to go with him, and then 2 competent instinctives. With the theory being that if I wanted to move the fighting troops forward quickly in a game, and I had the option, and I got enough information from the scouting to do, or deployment to do so, I could stick 4 units of the fighting infantry all together in a big block, and I would be pretty guaranteed to be able to double march them on the first turn, even though a couple of them were probably tribal. And I'd used that on, I think I used it once. I think I used it in the first game against Will Denham, who was playing with medieval Swedish, some variant of Swedish, which had a lot of crossbow loose infantry with polearm front ranks, and so obviously I wanted to get to grips with those as soon as possible, and so I used that trick there. Thereafter, I played armies that it didn't really suit that policy, but I did try and set it up so I had that as an option. I do think some players don't give enough thought to how their commanders are going to command their army. I mean, I can't claim to have always get it right. It's not uncommon for me to go and put my generals down and go, how am I going to, why did I put those 3 units together over there? That's not going to work, and so forth. But I think it does reward a bit of pen and paper work beforehand to try and work out some options on what you're going to do with your commanders.
Yeah, absolutely. Thoroughly agree with that. No, I like that's an interesting mix of 2 professional and 2 instinctive, which I have to say is a combination I haven't tried, but see opportunities to try that out at some point.
I've tried something similar before with a mid-Republican army, a mid-Republican Roman army. It's quite a nice feel. I had some allies instead. It's quite a nice feel. If you do decide, you can decide to float your general, and you don't even have to look at the cards. You just pass them all to one side, and it's quite refreshing.
Yeah, I mean, I quite like it, this setup, because if the professional presumably will always command troops, because you've only got 2 professionals, floating would be a bit daft. Although it does mean that one general will get 7 cards. It's it does mean that the talented, you can say, well, he can have 5 cards if he needs it, and that does make quite a bit of difference.
Mathematically, it does still actually make sense sometimes to float, depending on the area you're trying to command. If all the troops of those 2 generals of command are going to be comfortably within one general's range, what you do is mitigate the bad cards by having them all in one place. So it does work quite well that way. I can do.
I varied floating him and not floating him depending on how much space I needed to take up, and also to some extent on the opponent's card count, or what expected card count. So playing the Lithuanians.
Yeah.
Well, the closest I had, well, they were a shooty cavalry army, really. Just and so I did deliberately not float the CNC so he could command the unit, and it kind of gives you an extra card because it lets you upgrade a black to something to move a unit.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's interesting that you both think that floating is potentially a good thing. With just one subby, I'd have put it in the I'm not going to do that category.
Wow.
So you know, but you know, and yep. Who am I to argue with a man who came second at a competition?
Just to mention generals, actually, I found something I was learning through as I use my list, because one of the issues with Cantabrian horse archers is you need to pay a card to move them, to put them into Cantabrian. And I took me till the last game to work out that the best thing to do was to put a general with a Cantabrian unit so that I could use a black card to convert them. I messed it up slightly in the second game because I remembered to put the two generals in question with a horse archer unit, and then realised that I'd put one of them with the one unit of skirmishers that didn't have Cantabrian. It could have been tough. So best side plans.
It is, yes. So just out of interest, Paul, which armies did you play?
So I played Will Dunham's later Swedish. I couldn't tell you the exact name of it in the first rounds.
Medieval Swedish.
Yeah, it's medieval Swedish is the army.
Yeah.
And then I think I played Lee Saunders second.
No, did you play me second?
I played.
Oh, no, I was third. It was third.
Yeah, I played the Clash of the Pools was third, and then I played Steve Spedding in the final game. So I played two late Crusaders, one sit and shoot infantry army, and one shooty cavalry army, essentially. So a pretty good mix. I had 4 cracking games, and I must say, the game against Lee I probably enjoyed the most, even though it was all I lost. It was a real both sides having several units within a base or or a wound of breaking, with our armies on the brink of going. The next unit went, and it just happened to be that Lee got it over on me on the last knockings, even though I was about halfway through. I was sort of 2 sets to 1 up, and then he came back.
How appropriate with Wimbledon going on at the current time. So yeah, so well, I mean, obviously you got 53 points, came second, so we could think, I think we can say the army worked. And again, it's just obviously people are trying to put me in my place because I keep writing it off and going, nah, it's just not good enough. I know we should point out as well that Sam Street, using Almoravid, the African version, came third. So I'm well and truly eating humble pie, I think.
Well, I mean, certainly the selection of armies that were picked had me both rejoicing and somewhat apprehensive at the same time. In as much as when you look at all the charging knights and you've got long speed, you kind of think this should be a competition I could do well at. So there was a bit of self-imposed pressure there once the runners and riders came out.
I've always had the feeling, looking at it, when you pick it compared to some of the other tough infantry armies, it doesn't look so good, but it's probably an army that does better in period. That's my gut feeling with the Almoravid.
Yeah, it could well be. Some do, and oddly, some do better out of period. It's one of those strange things. Okay, Paul, thank you, and obviously once again, well done. I am going to pick on the other Paul for the next one. So I think we move from a mainly foot army to
entirely cavalry.
Entirely cavalry army. So
entirely mounted, later Lithuanian. From my point of view, chosen in reaction to foot sluggers, I think, because that put me off infantry for a little while after had a lovely army that played so badly with it. And I don't think it works for the way I think, the way I want to play. I want to try, basically, what I want to do is I want to try and make a mess of the battlefield and then jump on something. So the later Lithuanians, the shoot and charge, perfect. You can run away from everybody until the battlefield's a mess, and then you can make an even more of a mess when you come back in again. Earlier versions, I kept trying it with the knights, and as I mentioned earlier, just throwing them away with it. So either Polish knights or Teutons, whichever I used, I ended up just losing them without any gain. So it was shoot and charge all the way down. So I think I had six sixes of flexible, unprotected short spear shoot and charge, a couple of sixes of superior, not flexible, protected shoot and charge, 2 4s of average, and another 4 of superior. So it's 11 in total. Split up into 2 internal allies, just desperately trying to scrape enough points to get all the toys that I wanted. And I thought, yeah, the chance of losing both allies is pretty minimal. I didn't manage to lose both allies. I only lost one ally for one game for most of a game, which was painful. But that was a game that was going horribly wrong from the start when I managed to pull 5 blacks and 5 whites for the PBS. And from there on in, then straight into having an unreliable ally. Things were not going according to plan on the generals there. Making me think that it's not worth worrying too much about the PBS because it's so random. If you're trying to get your professional general in, or your higher paid general, your higher card general in there as your CNC to try and get those extra cards, it's a one-off shot and it's quite a lot of extra points. Is it worth it? I'm beginning to think less so than it was. But anyway, the whole point of the army was to run around, make a mess, and then jump on things. It worked in places. I played map first of all, and it had a couple of moments, but I got blatted. Up against the Crusade of Nicopolis, Dave Parish, where this is where my cards, that one with all the blacks and whites and the PBS and the unreliable ally, sit there in the middle of the battlefield for the entire game until he charged it, which was very kind of him because I only needed a yellow to come back on side then, and they just held on just long enough for me to win with pretty much 1 wound to go. And that's the only game really where the shoot and charge kicked in. I just didn't quite manage to get things in the right place at the right time. I didn't manage to make enough of a mess in any of the games really until that one. But it did have the glorious moment when the knights charging the unit, and so Crusaders charging one of my units needed to break 1 unit to take the game, and so they would sort this shoot and charge back again and broke them before contact, which was joyous and made my day. So it was worth spending all the points on shoot and charge the entire army just for that moment. Saved the army and broke the enemy in one go. Genius. I think it's quite a fun army, but it's not very complex. It just takes a bit of work. And I think actually listening again to Paul's description of his army, what suddenly came back to me was the skirmishers alongside the foot just made a mess of my army. And I think people are beginning to bring more foot skirmishers, and I wonder if that's beginning to put the kibosh on the shooting cavalry armies, begins to reduce their effectiveness, because you don't want to get into a shooting match with foot skirmishers because they're really cheap, and every time they do you damage, it hurts, and suddenly you're no longer sitting in front of a block of pike or block of spears shooting them and upsetting them horribly. You're taking casualties back again, and that's no fun as a shooting cavalry army. You need to get out of there, and then you run out of room. So I wonder, as struck me listening to Paul a minute ago, thinking about how it went for my game, that might be why there's been a reduction in the number of shooting cavalry armies. And now I'm regretting my choice for the next competition of taking Huns. With exactly the same concept. I mean, that's the problem with the Lithuanians, is the lack of anything really heavy in there. So you don't have any melee expert or skilled shooters. So it's, well, there's a couple of superior units. fairly vanilla, fairly average all the way through. The only thing really got going for it is the shoot and charge, which is still glorious.
It is. It is. Yeah. Yes. Can't think what to say about that. I'll let everybody else talk.
It's a difficult army to comment on because it's just a whole bunch of experienced bow, short spear, shooting charge cavalry. It is what it is.
It is. There's nothing complicated in there.
Again, it's another army I wish I'd fought. I'd have quite enjoyed it, I think. But there you are.
Yeah. Did you fight a later Crusader?
No. The only Crusaders I fought were the Crusader Nicopolis, which is the game that I won there. So
yeah, I could imagine it wouldn't like facing a later Crusader.
That's sort of what I was hoping to fight a bit more, because that's the sort of army I could force to run around a bit and get in a mess. It relies on getting the enemy into a mess as opposed to actually winning. So, to be honest, I need to fight incompetent people.
Yeah. Now, the reason I said that was I was thinking, well, certainly in terms of the ones that were taken to the competition, which quite often had the mixed foot shooting ones that we talked about earlier, and 3 units of Mamluks.
The Mamluks were a concern.
It's I've generally found when I've used that sort of cavalry, if somebody's got not quite so good shooters, although the Mamluks aren't skilled shooters, they're superior protected, and anything you just come up close to unprotected units, that's really quite horrible.
Yeah.
And so it's it is, yeah, it is what it is, isn't it?
Yeah. Now there are more imaginative and more complex versions of things you can do with it, but I thought I'd just go for simple.
Yeah, why not on occasion?
It has its moments.
Yeah. So, would you use it again? Or would
would I use it as a completely vanilla version? Yeah, I probably would actually. I probably would. Maybe there are better ways of doing a similar army, though. I think Huns for a start. Same sort of idea, except you've got some skill shooters and you can stand the fight. Because they've got no melee expert, you're having to try and hold on to cards to try and withdraw, break off from combats and go in again. That was the sort of part of the plan. I never managed to have the cards at the time when I needed them. I didn't really get in a fight against the Almoravids and against the Crusade with a general not online, so 3 cards down. I never had spare cards. That was disappointing for that. But yeah,
it is. Yeah. So, okay, well, thank you for that. I think I'm going to ask Richard to go next, leaving Matt to the end, as we often do, just to finish off with whatever Matt's latest insane army is. And also, I'm just liking the symmetry of starting with an Ottoman and ending with an Ottoman. Call that some sort of peculiar OCD, if you like. So, Richard, over to you about your army.
So I chose medieval Portuguese with a Castilian ally. Which had a competent professional army commander, a Castilian ally who was competent instinctive, and 2 further competent instinctive subgenerals. So I only had 12 cards, which in practice I found out was just about okay, but I think it was really on the sort of minimum that you could get away with. The army itself consists of a unit of best knights who they're mixed. All the knight units are mixed knights and sergeants, so half fully armored, half protected, front rank charging lancer. The best knights were superior devastating charger melee expert, so they're up with the best really. I had 2 units of ordinary knights, so they're just average form loose charging lancer melee expert, but the critical thing is they are dismountable. So I had the option of dismounting them as fully armoured two-handed cut and crush form close infantry. So that was part of the rationale for choosing the army. Along with that, I had 2 units of spearmen, 8 of protected short spear shield wall, and 3 units of protected experienced crossbow. And those are the sort of, they're not combat shy or anything, so they're quite meaty, because you get the extra S when they're charged, you know, for the shooting. So and then the Castilian ally consisted of a unit of knights, just 6 again charging lance and melee expert average, but supported by 2 units of Castilian Jeanettes, who are skirmisher average protected, experienced javelin, short spear Cantabrian. So they're quite nice because they're protected cavalry skirmishers and Cantabrian. And then just to use up the remaining points, I had a unit of handgunners, just 6 protected experienced firearm. So that was the army. The plan with it was to use the spearmen and crossbowmen in combination, and if the opportunity presented, to dismount the average knights to be fully armoured, two-handed cut and crush to support the infantry, and then to use the Castilians really as a protection around one flank, and to use the best knights wherever the opportunity presented themselves. I chose it really hoping if it came up against shooty armies that I'd have enough of the crossbowmen, and the fact I could have the fully armoured foot, that it could give those sort of armies a problem. My one concern was that it could be out-knighted by something like the later Crusader with its fanatical order knights. And indeed, in the competition, the army that bested it was Keith Spedding's later Crusader, where although he actually got a 15-6, the game was actually a lot closer than the score might suggest. I had at least a couple of units that were sort of a wound off breaking. Yeah, overall, I had 4 good games. I started out by playing Sid and his medieval, I think it was medieval Polish with a Hussite ally. Yeah, I like chopping up war wagons with my axes. Just a rules point, Simon. I think that two-handed cut and crush should get +2 against battle wagons, not just the +1.
That makes sense.
Yeah, then followed up second game was against Ian. He was using Astor Leonese, which was quite an interesting choice because he had 24 superior protected charging lancer knights. Those are the early ones, plus a unit of 4 Teutonic orders. So I was actually out-knighted in that game, but used the infantry to beat up his infantry before he could break my knights. Third game against Keith was the one I lost. He just had better knights, although interestingly my crossbow were more than a match for his mixed spear and crossbow, so I was quite happy about that. And then the final game, I played Dave's Crusade of Nicopolis. And I think it's fair to say that things went well for me in that game and didn't favour Dave too well. But yeah, cracking competition and very pleased. I think I ended up 4th, which was very
indeed.
Did you say your protected crossbows were an 8s?
They are, yeah, 3 lots of 8.
Okay.
I tended to deploy them with the spears 2 wide in between the 8s of the crossbow, and then protecting the flanks with the knights generally. On the whole, they seem to do okay.
I must confess, I dither between 6 and 8s for those sort of troops, for those like crossbowmen. I think 4 wide, they get less manoeuvrable, and I've sort of had a dislike of having a 3rd rank which doesn't do any shooting. Maybe I'm.
Yeah, I've found with the 8s that the trick, I suppose one trick I used was to advance and contract them into a 2 wide column and then push the knights through. That's certainly caught out a couple of my opponents who perhaps hadn't expected that. I just find the 6s are too vulnerable.
Yep.
So I mean, occasionally I would use if they're going to face shooting opposition, I'm quite happy to put them 3 wide and then have the extra ranks to fill in the gaps to continue the shooting once you take the casualties, because if you're reduced to 1 rank, it really reduces your opportunities in the shooting competition. But yeah, I've found if you downgrade them with the combat shy, they just become too vulnerable to too many opponents. Whereas if you keep them without the combat, keep them with no combat shy, they can hold up their own in melee as well, because your opponent's taking casualties coming in. So
yeah. It can be tempting to give them combat shy because you get a pretty substantial point saving. But as you say, they become significantly weaker if anybody gets into contact with them. So it's yeah. Just a point. Just make sure I've got this right. You see, with your average knights and sergeants combos, they dismount entirely as fully armoured.
They do indeed, yes.
So the sergeant's part sort of get a bit of an upgrade.
Yes, that's intentional. It also makes it points effective.
Yeah.
You're not losing too many points.
What would you use 2-handed cut and crush specifically against? Because I'm always a bit worried looking at them, because they look like an expensive unit that's very, very vulnerable in the charge.
Well, they are 2 mounted, but I mean they might have held their own against the superior long spear foot, for example, in combination with the crossbow. So that was the sort of idea that, and obviously they're ideal for going against battle wagons, because normally you have to get to 4 and then dismount if you're going to face a battle wagon, whereas I could dismount and go in straight away.
Makes sense.
I did catch Sid's Hussite war wagons a bit on the hop by double marching forward and then carrying on at full speed into the wagons.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And just one question might be obvious. I presume the Castilian ally was taken mainly to get those Jeanettes.
Yes, that was the main reason for having the.
Yeah. Which presumably helped your scouting as well.
It put me on 4 scouting cards. Yeah, if you take the Portuguese without the Castilians, you're restricted to 1 unit of Jeanettes, I believe. So it was just a combination that I'd come across and tried and quite liked.
Saves quite a few points as well, doesn't it, having a competent ally?
It does. It's obviously there's that risk that they might go hesitant, but it's one I've found I'm happy to live with. It didn't happen in the 4 games I had at the weekend. So.
Yeah. I'm quite a big fan as well of that. So
I would say from list checking, as I do quite a bit, and I know Richard's been espousing this approach for some time, I think I could say, without doing a scientific survey, more people are taking competent allies than they used to, as opposed to talented. There was a stage where all allies were talented, and I know we did play around with the points slightly, didn't we, Richard, to try and make that a little less of a no-brainer. It was suggesting that the points for talented allies was too cheap. But I think people are now they're signing up to it in the way, they're signing up to using skirmishers, as Paul S pointed out, and maybe this is why there was a bit of a reluctance to take shooty cavalry armies in this one. I wonder if the counter will be look for shooty cavalry armies that have protected flexible types rather than the unprotected flexible types.
Possibly, or maybe shooty cavalry armies that have their own skirmishers as well.
Heaven forfend. People are going to start suggesting that we take infantry with our cavalry armies. Mr. Cummings is
You've got to have some peasants who are too poor to afford a horse.
Yeah, they're the opposition. The opposition provide them arrow fodder. So all in all, so it is, and I think we now move on to the highlight that is always Mr. Haywood's peculiar and idiosyncratic takes on lists. Oh, actually, before we go further, because it was mentioned, and I meant to mention it at the beginning, Dave Parrish taking the Crusade of Nicopolis army. I was just so pleased that somebody took it to this competition, because it was one of the armies allowed from House of Osman. Is that House of Osman?
House of Osman, yes.
House of Osman that was specifically allowed to this, and it's I think it's to mention slight insanity, because Dave is always good for an oddball army as well. So I think it's sort of just a shame that GK didn't play him, because that would have been they had the dates the same. That could have been almost the real battle. Although you didn't have the Janissaries that were at the battle.
Yeah, that's true.
So anyway, enough of my waffling on. But big props to Dave for taking that army. As I said, I was so pleased when he sent it through and I could list check it. So anyway, Mr. Haywood,
Right.
over to you for your Ottoman.
Right, my Ottoman is a rough-going shooty cavalry army. That's what it was designed at. Right, you all know I have a bit of an OCD when it comes to campaign to competitions and looking at what people might bring. So I really like Ottomans, liked them for years, could never get them to work in under any rules set, and I've always thought Meg was the best chance for it to work as it should. So that was the start of the army. I did a load of play tests where I deliberately avoided the Serbs because I wanted to see if I could get a vanilla one to work. And in the end, I decided that what the Serbs brought to the table was either a punch or a heavy enough delaying force that it would allow you to do whatever you wanted to do on the other side of the table whilst not worrying too much about what's punching a hole through the other flank. So in the end, it had to have the Serbs. For this competition, I thought there were going to be a lot of Crusaders. I also thought that the Almoravids would show up. So I assumed there was going to be a fair amount of heavy infantry. Now, the later Crusaders, obviously, the front rank of their crossbowmen are close order foot. So what I looked at was an Ottoman army that was very capable at fighting in rough and difficult going. So that meant I wanted all 16 Janissaries. And then, oddly, I wanted all the light horse. And I'll explain why in a minute. And then there's an upgrade or a downgrade, depending on how you look at it, for the bog standard Azab archers. And you can, I think we discussed it in the last podcast, actually, you can actually regrade them to have barricades. Now, as daft as that may sound, what that gives you in the list that I ran, which I'll talk about in a minute, it gives you a 9 base width piece of terrain that you can put in your table, your deployment area, that makes it immune to mounted. Mounted cannot go through that piece of terrain. So what that gives you is a 9 base width wide area where you can put your Serbs, move cavalry backwards and forwards behind your line, and only enemy infantry is going to get close enough to deal anything about it, because their mounted can go sit on the other side of the barricade and look at you riding past, exposing your flank all day. So you know, waving at them as you go past. So that was the idea. So the aim was an army that was capable of fighting rough and difficult going, which would either attack into nasty terrain or would defend in nasty terrain. So right, let's talk about the list. I went with 3 competent professional generals and a competent instinctive ally, which was the Serb. Poor unfortified camp. You've got pretty much no choice there, really, unless you want Mopar, and I couldn't see any reason to take it. So you then have 2 blocks of 8 Janissaries, which are the drilled loose, superior protected, skilled boat. I then went with 2 blocks of the average Sfahi, who are, first block is a block of 6, which is average protected, experienced bow, short spear, so standard for the list, normal Ottoman cavalry. The second unit was a block of 4, which I downgraded to poor, unskilled bow. Basically, they're it always turns up on the list. It's my delaying unit. It's the one I throw out on the flank and don't care about. And then you have 2 blocks of Serbs. Now, the first, they're all front rank, average, fully armored, charging lancer, dev charger, melee expert. Back ranks are the same but protected. So there was a block of 6 and a block of 4. I'd have loved 2 blocks of 6, but I just couldn't get the points to work. That's it for tugs. So that only gives you 7 tugs. So it breaks on 4.
I think you've missed one out.
Oh, best Fahi. Thank you. Yes, sorry. The only reason I missed them out is they did bugger all. They did nothing in almost all my games. Sorry. So their cavalry formed loose, superior protected, experienced bow, short spear, block of 6. Despite the fact they're the best Fahi, as a unit, again, it's another delayer as far as I'm concerned. They don't have melee experts. Same problem Paul has with his Lithuanians. Once they're in combat, beyond the charge, even being superior, they're going to get whittled down fairly quickly, and they just don't give you the punch. But anyway, so they're 7 tugs, sorry, so break of 4. But I've then got 6 sugs. Now there's the Jambazan, who are cavalry skirmishers, average unprotected, skilled bow, melee expert. Now the melee expert is compulsory. So I actually bought them for the skilled bow, not the melee expert. And there's a reason for that. And then 2 blocks of Akinji, who are skirmishers, average, unprotected, experienced bow, Cantabran, combat shy. Did I get it right again?
No, you cocked it up this time.
Damn!
You hit your high point at the last one.
Yeah, that's it. I'm done now, aren't I? That skirmishy thing with the bow, that costs points. Anyway, I'm not even going to try and say it again. I'm sulking. Right. Anyway. And then there are handgunners, which are infantry skirmishers, average protected firearm, experienced firearm, combat shy. And then there's the Azab archers that I mentioned earlier, which are skirmishers, poor, unprotected, unskilled bow, barricades, combat shy. Block of 9. Now, they're 35 points each and gives me 9 barricades. I'm not going to argue with that. 315 points for 9 base width worth of terrain, effectively. And then there's the Balkan light horse. Now, they're cavalry skirmishers, average, unprotected, charging lancer, block of 6. Honestly, useless. But I had 200 and something of points to spend. So I took them. They actually had uses in some of the games, but didn't really justify them being there. But anyway, and that gave me a PBS of 8 and a scouting of 5. So that's the army. Its use was pretty much, the aim was either to defend in mountains if I could, or attack into mountains if I could, or any rough going. So I think in all my games where I had a chance to control the terrain, it went into the densest possible area it could. In fact, I think against Paul, I put it in the really dense area because I actually had fairly rubbish cards, and I expected to have Paul coming with his Lithuanians move it out a few pegs, and actually we matched each other card for, we dealt identical hands, and we matched each other card for card. And the damn thing did not move, and so it was like very dense in mountainous terrain.
For 2 cavalry armies.
For 2 cavalry.
I was surprised.
Yeah. Well, to be fair, the entire basis of the army was built around, it can't fight knights frontally, even with Janissaries. In the open, fighting those is a dead loss. So while on table with enough terrain that my opponent has to cover it, he has to put stuff in it, particularly if you can place it in his deployment zones. So that was the aim. The Janissaries would then move through the terrain. Now, okay, they've got no melee weapon, but they're skilled shooters, drilled loose, and they're superior. It makes it incredibly hard for any kind of infantry to close to them. If they're close order infantry, they don't want to go into the rough, because actually I win in the rough. If they come and fight me, I'll shoot the hell out of them, and then I'll beat them up in combat. That which brings me back to the Jan Bazan skilled bowman. Why take skilled and not take the Kinji, which would have been slightly cheaper? It's because if you put a block of 16 Janissaries in mountainous terrain, difficult terrain, you can stick a block of skilled horse archers on the end of that line and and tug the sug, as it were, and they move 3 and they still shoot a skilled bow. If you do that with an Akinji unit, they're only moving 2 because they're formed up in Cantabrian. Yes, no,
yes.
whatever. Yeah, okay. So it slows your entire line down. So it allows you to put the light horse on the end of the line and drag it along, because they can deploy within 5 of the table edge. The other thing is, if you're using rough going, if you deploy 2 lots of Kinji and the Jambazan into a piece of rough going and shoot out of it, actually anybody who comes in can't push you out of it. The only way they can push you away is if you're entirely in it, they've got to charge you. Okay, you want to charge a light horse in rough going, you go for it. If you're close order foot, fine. You're taking a risk. You're going to get shot down, particularly if there's a couple of units Janissary sat by going, hi. You know. So there's that. The Serbs, I took a competent instinctive. They were always going to deploy at the back. Probably either behind the barricade, as in the to one edge, so they could always maneuver either way without being interfered with. And if they went unreliable, then I've got a few turns to send out some skirmishers, slow them down, do whatever I need to do. Surprisingly, it worked quite well. First 3 games, max 15 points for each.
Argue with it.
Yeah. I got my arse handed. Sorry, I got kicked slightly by Lee in the last round on the top table, but I will say I had a third of his army within breaking point of the units breaking. I was about to launch a charge on, I think they were unprotected, poor, combat-shy, unskilled bowmen that were guarding his fortified camp with 2 blocks of Janissaries, or with a block of Janissaries. Anyway. It was a glorious failure on my part for that game, but what can I say? It was anecdotes that Paul won't appreciate. Paul charges his superior cavalry straight into a block of 8 Janissaries, never gets the cards in which to pull them out, and promptly ends up fighting 16 Janissaries. They didn't last long.
That was the end of that flank.
That was the end of that flank. Yeah. 16 Janissaries just sort of kept walking up. And in fact, the Serbs in that one, I think, did a glorious job of standing in the center and just going, well, I'm just going to stand here mostly. I think the Jambazan engaged a unit of his flexible foot that were in flexible horse that were in Sug formation, and then they battered each other senseless for a very long time and held up the other flank. The anecdote that Nick mentioned at the very beginning was against Lee. To be fair, I think I got a little overeager, but I set up 2 flank Serbian charges into 2 blocks of his knights. So I was going to hit both in the flank, having sacrificed my random unit of rubbish to force him to pursue straight past the main block of Serbs. And the others, Fahi on the other side had done something similar. They were supposed to break off and retreat, but they just died on the spot and ran away, which was fine because it still put them in. Ingo, both units of Serbs straight in the flank. I think we were +6 on the dice. So, reds and yellows all across the board. I've never seen so many S's in my life. I did nothing. Literally, he turned around and then butchered me. And that pretty much ended the game there. But you know, you can only go and do so much before the dice gods go, ha. But no. The army worked how I planned it. It was a really fun experience. I was about to say I have a slightly more sensible list for it, but I'm not sure that class is a sensible, but one which has slightly more resilience, shall we say, which I may run in the future. But no, really enjoyed it. Really enjoyed all my games. I played Paul as Lithuanians. I played Sam's Almvorids, in which the Serbs did glorious duty. They butchered the tribal Berber foot in spectacular style. I fought Pete Entwistle's later Crusader. The highlight of that game was the skirmishing light horse from a bit of rough going took 2 bases off his average Mamluks in the first turn.
Oh, lovely.
So the unit was immediately useless to him, and he had to keep trying to get it backwards away, which of course left the flank of his superior Mamluks open to being shot at. The Serbs were sacrificed to hold his night line, and instead just cut their way through it and went for his camp, which bless Pete, was just like, he took it in remarkably good stead. But I think he threw 12 superior knights at 5 frontage of average formed. So he was one better on across the line to me, and we deeply upset him on that one. He got his own revenge though when he destroyed a unit of Janissaries 8-0 in a turn with crossbowmen. It was just I've never seen anything, and it was in combat, and it was green versus green. Just butchered me across the line, and I just sat there and went, yeah, fair cop. I killed your knights. You killed those. Yeah, I'm not going to complain about that one. Wow. Yeah, it was all exceptional games. The game against Lee, first class. Loved it. Despite the actual butchering I got, could have gone either way in a few occasions. But yeah, really good. So there you are. That's the army. That's my latest insanity.
Did you play Pete in game 2? Because
yes,
he must be getting a bit fed up with those knights, because he had 2 of his units of average knights got killed by 1 unit of superior, 1 unit of 4 superior Sipai with a little bit of extra skirmishing shooting in the game against me, and the Sipai rode away with not even a wound.
we obviously scared him so much that the mere word of Ottoman sent them running for the hills.
So whilst you obviously you won 3 games, so it wasn't a factor, Matt, but obviously you've got 7 tugs here, so you break on 4. Would it have made much difference in the last game, or was it just one of those games? You know, you say you roll so many S's, it just wasn't to be. If you'd had an extra break point, the more
it would have made a difference. It would have given me another turn in which I would possibly, even though his camp was fortified, have taken it. And as I say, about a third of his army was close to breaking, so those extra cab tests might well have done it. To be honest, I think Lee would still have won it, but I might have come away with some points rather than no points.
It was a 15-0, was it?
Oh yes, yeah.
It's one of those. Yeah,
it was one of those. It was a completely fair game. I can't complain about the dice, but yeah. Well, I can complain about the dice, all those S's, but you know.
Yeah. Of course, you complain about the dice. It's what we do. So I must admit, I really like the look of that army.
I have to say, I was expecting to find out what the Balkan Light Horse, the cunning plan of the Balkan Light Horse was, and then he said you just picked it because you had the point spare. So
it almost became an ablative shield. It would hang around on the side edge of any of the light horse units, and then basically go and interpose between them and archery. So they were taking the hits whilst all the superior all the skilled shooting units were relatively protected. That's what they did against Lee. They got absolutely mullered by a unit of crossbowmen, but in turn, all the Akinji and stuff were shooting back and took his crossbowmen down to almost breaking. So
I suppose they're quite scary for a skirmish as well, aren't they? Because they charge 6 base widths to start with, so it must be a bit of a difficult thing to run away if you're a sug. So.
Oh yeah, they can do exactly that, and, but I never had the opportunity because nobody brought skirmishy shooty cavalry armies.
I just now got this impression of it. As GK just said, you took it basically because you had some points to fill. You put it down. The opponent starts thinking, "Oh, that's unusual. He must have a cunning plan," and start really sort of thinking what they're going to do, and all you're thinking of is arrow fodder.
I hadn't thought about it like that. Yeah.
Occupy some space. Your opponent's scratching his head somewhere, and you beat him up with the other stuff.
I have to say, Nick, you play a very different game from me, because I work on the principle that if I haven't a clue what I'm going to do with these things, then why should my opponent have any clue how they're going to work with their troops?
Yeah, the thing is, if you know you haven't got a clue, that's one thing. If they don't have a clue, they can worry about it. You may have made peace with yourself about your own troops being, I don't know, I'm going to push them out there or leave them at the back or just move them about randomly, which I must admit I have done with skirmishers occasionally. Oh, I've got a white card left. I'll just move these skirmishers over there because I can, rather than discard the card. I feel, no, I'm going to make a move with it. And the skirmishers, so it's relatively safe.
My comedy moment also comes against Lee Saunders, and is indeed to do with my skirmishy infantry, who had the chance to charge unit whose knights in the flank, because they were within a base width of breaking. In fact, they were within a wound of breaking. Hurled themselves into the fray, gloriously on white dice to his red. Which is good, which is not bad going for a flank attack. You end up on white and he gets the red. They did manage the wound at the second attempt though, because I had 2 files. So it was a glorious victory for them. But yeah, it comes with a government health warning. Charging knights in the flank when you're a skirmisher doesn't necessarily work in your favour.
There are an awful lot of pluses the unit you're charging can get to make it a really bad. I like that. I'll charge him in the flank. I'm on white. He's on red. Yep. Yeah, it's one of those. He wouldn't even pay the cart to turn round for melee, would he? I'll just carry on like this.
Sort of knight reverses the sword and stabs behind him.
Yeah.
They leave the horse to kick him to death.
Yeah. There's so many comedy scenarios.
The only thing I'd say, going back to what we were talking about earlier, I actually floated the army commander in all my games. The army was designed for the army commander to float in that one, because it meant that whichever flank I was having the most luck with or the most success with, because of my skill, obviously, they could get most of the cards, and it smooths off that rough area where you get 3 blacks or something in one command. Unless the army commander's joining in the hilarity, you've at least got something you can throw over to keep it all going. So the army was literally designed to work like that.
Yeah. That makes sense. I mean, because you, although you've not got many tugs, you've got quite a lot of sugs there that still need moving, and obviously the Kinjis and Janzaban were quite important to how you're going to win games.
Yeah. Oh, they were integral. Without them, it would have been a lot tougher.
It's cool. Okay. Well, one, it sounds like everybody had some really good games. I'm really doubly upset I couldn't make it now. Although I'm not sure I would have been overly up the table. I think I would have been behind most people, because I'm not sure my army was terribly well thought out in retrospect. I think I was thinking more of that. So just on the theme, as I said, I get the impression it was a goodie.
And I'd go with that.
Not a criticism, but a comment on it. Is going back to what I kind of said about the cross and crescent difference. I did look at using Tafia Andalusian to play El Cid, but when you look at the earlier knights, it is a thing in pretty much any war games rules. It's certainly true in Meg. Going in 1 factor down is not a good look. Sometimes you can outnumber the guy enough, and 2 factors down, suddenly you're looking to white dice them to death. But just being a single factor down and paying almost as many points as they paid tends to be a bit of a losing proposition. So I mean, I don't think there were very few charging lancers out there that weren't dev charging and fully armored. I think, at least in their front ranks. So I'm not. I think in some respects the Cross and Crescent period. No, it's not fair. I think the difference is you're going to get different. You're going to get a different set of lists from essentially the same theme in a sense. It's the Crusades, but by putting the date a lot later, you definitely skew the list selection in that way. I think, and it probably. I don't know what. I don't think it should have made a difference to the shooty cav, because I guess the more expensive the knights, the better it is for the shooty cavalry. Because
yeah, well, until you get armored horse added, which then slows down the knights. Just being fully armored doesn't affect the shooting. What it does mean is if they do get to hand combat, they're more likely to go through you.
Yeah.
But there's some. I'd have to, analyze the list to say this, but I think there is one balancing factor in that the earlier lists with protected versions tend to have more superiors, which sort of balances it out.
So
If in fact they'll, against an average unit of fully armored, they'll be up. It'll be the protected ones that are up in charge because they're superior, and then you'll be the same in melee combat. It's if you're the same morale.
They often don't have dev charge the early ones as well, though, because I did in fact fight one of those, and you are even your level.
Yeah,
Fully
I think
armor gives you one in melee, and the dev charge gives you one in the charge.
Yeah,
I think Ian used the Aster Leonese, and that I think had 24 superior protected charging lancer knights, and I think it had 4 extra superiors from the military orders. So it's the quantity of knights it gets rather than the initial factor. I think there is a good army there with the Aster Leonese that could actually be quite competitive even against some of the later knight armies. Yeah, I think the Crusades do tend to split between the earlier armies where the knights aren't quite as powerful and the later ones where they are.
Yeah.
One of the things that disappointed me with the theme was that some of the historically valid armies weren't available either as ally or because they weren't in the right list set. And one of the things I hope to do for the next army list index is to have some themes, suggested themes, which actually lists all the valid historical armies for a particular theme. So there might be a whole range of those from early biblical periods through to Crusades and beyond.
Actually, I'm good to pick up on that because that actually is a real bugbear. Something that niggles me about some of the competition themes that are come up with. I presume you're referring to the fact that there was a list of eligible armies, if you like, either whole PDFs or specific armies that were named from other PDFs, and the competition theme rules said that allies could only also be from those lists. Now, I know for a fact that in this particular competition, that definitely excluded historical examples. You couldn't do I think it's the German half of the Second Crusade springs to mind, and you couldn't do the Iobid army that fought at La Forbie, a quite important battle. And I think I'll hold my hands up. So I think I included it in Warfare last year. But I was thinking, I'm not entirely sure where this has come from or whether it actually makes competitions any better. My gut feeling is that it doesn't. It's unnecessary. And, as in the case with God Wills It, cuts out some perfectly good historical combinations. And we're supposed to be playing a historical based game. Okay, the themes do throw out real fantasy matchups, if you want to call them that, but the underlying base is supposed to be historical. So I don't know if anybody knows where this came from.
I don't, but I guess the counter question is, how many of the allies? I mean, I don't know the answer to this. History, I'm not anywhere near as knowledgeable in history as you guys, but how many of the allies that might have been picked could have created an army that shouldn't be there? For example, there was one with Golden Horde ally, which probably wouldn't really feature in the Crusades, for example. That's the counter argument, I guess.
Well, it worked both ways in that there was some completely invalid armies if your theme was Crusades, which were permitted. Medieval Norwegian was one I actually looked at, just to bugger everybody up, really. And on the other flip side, there were 3 or 4 valid allied combinations that weren't permitted. So it's just, yeah, I felt it was, I sort of feel the same way, I guess, as Nick does, that if you're going to make it a historical theme, make it a historical theme.
You're always going to come to stage if you're at the limit of your knowledge, and it becomes quite difficult after that. I suppose you could say, Richard, Nick, I want to do this. Can you tell me what should be allowed? But beyond that, it'll be.
Well, I think that, and that is why I would like to add these suggested themes into the index to allow people who are organising the competitions, which is work and it is appreciated, to understand it. The sort of solution that hopefully makes it easier for them.
Great idea, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is. And Richard's absolutely right to emphasise that, the people who organise these competitions are doing it out of the goodness of their heart, and we do appreciate it. So, I hope no organiser out there think, when I'm saying I don't see the point of it, that I'm having a real go at it. It's, I've lived with it. I will live with it. If somebody puts it in a competition, it'll be there. It's. I just question whether it's absolutely necessary, but I do see the point DK made about, there could be combination. I'm saying, it's excluding valid combinations, but it's also excluding what you would call invalid combinations. So
before I realised that, there was certainly one list that I realised you could get an ally with 3 blocks of skilled power bow in it, for example. I think that was right. Maybe it's 2 blocks of skilled power bow, rather 3 blocks of power bow, 2 of which were skilled, and obviously that maybe wouldn't have fit, and that would have been allowed if you'd allowed all the allies, for example.
Yeah, I think there's.
I don't know if that's accurate or not. Maybe it is.
Again, it would depend on the theme. Is it this one? Because this was
for this competition. There was one of the lists that was available.
Yeah, I think if you'd have allowed any allies, Portuguese could have had an English ally.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't have encouraged that, but it was the historically valid combinations that were excluded that I thought was the disappointing piece. Yeah, I certainly wouldn't have wanted to see medieval Portuguese with English ally in a crusade competition army. That wouldn't seem right to me.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, this was sort of Crusades-ish, wasn't it? But I still wouldn't have wanted to see the English in there. Yeah. For sure. So so that there was a definite benefit in not allowing them.
I think Richard might have something to say, as in Lionheart might have had something to say about that, excluding the English. Or are we classing him as Norman French?
He wasn't English.
He spent about 2 weeks in England his entire life, didn't he, or something like
that? He was actually born in England.
That was the 2 weeks, was it?
I think, but then in the most of his reign, England existed mainly as a piggy bank and manpower resource, and that was it. You would not call him English.
What I would say is I am enjoying the themed events, even if I don't necessarily agree with the theme as it's set out. I am enjoying themed events much more than open events. Sorry if you can the hound in the background.
I certainly would echo that. I much prefer themed events to open events.
Yeah, likewise. But I would say we definitely need to have open events in the calendar for those who prefer them or like them.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree.
Yeah, so yeah, just in case anybody starts saying, "Oh, the bloody historians," blah, 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 blah. Well, yes, but
I think from my experience, themed events are pretty good for people who know a fair bit about history and B, been playing the game for a while. Once you've been to a certain number of open events, you want something different. If you're just starting, then being able to use any of your armies and just go and play against anything is quite nice. The more you play, the more difference you want. Really, I think that's tends to be my experience in general wargaming competitions.
Probably fair. I have to say we got a couple of new players entered into foot sloggers because the range of troop types was actually a bit more limited, so they didn't have to worry so much. So there are ways of doing it to encourage people as well.
Yeah, for sure. I actually thought that not long before foot sloggers. I thought actually would be really good to almost advertise this as a beginners competition, because taking all the cavalry away, you're not getting the complicated skirmishes and all that interaction, would be a really good learning experience. So things like that can be very good. So, and it's nice for those of us who like going through lists. It gives you a different problem to try and solve. You've gone through all the lists a couple of times, or we can go through it with a different mindset, which is quite nice.
yeah, I think and I think we said previously about foot sloggers. What one of the nice things about that is once you got past the no cavalry. For me, who tend to use mounted armies a lot, and you actually started looking at it, as you say, go through the lists, see what is there. It was a lot more interesting than I initially thought it was. So there's lesson again for us all. Don't just look at it and go, have a bit of a look, have a bit of a think. But not every competition will suit everybody. Not everyone will be your favourite. So
and you don't have to either.
Yeah. I mean, maybe just one last question around themes before we move on and close up is I'm not sure we've had any, but are there any things that would make a bad theme?
I've got one thing which I think is sort of, maybe not a bad thing, but I sometimes feels a bit missing. There seems to be a generic. Again, I've not been playing for that long, but there's three, maybe four chariot era competitions, I'll call it now, and the general themes I'm seeing is chariot era, which is the three chariot books and Mandate from Heaven. And again, like you mentioned, the other one, you're not allowed to have any allies that don't come from those books. There's and then there's the classical era, which is generally sort of all the classical books. There do seem to be a few lists that get a bit left behind there because they're around the sort of 500 BC mark. Some of the allies that the later chariot era lists have got, you can't take because they're not in the chariot era books. You get they might be 700 BCE, but they're in the classical book. And there are a few classical armies I think that get a bit, don't really enjoy being bundled in with sort of Sarmatian lancers and things like that. I mean, I'm looking at the early Archimedes Persian, for example. Probably guys can tell me it does work, but it doesn't really have the tools to deal with charging lancers and things like that. But barring, well, actually, the early Archimedes Persian list just wouldn't have to deal with them. A bit later on, Alexander pops up, obviously, but then they've started recruiting more Greeks by then. But there's a few lists that feel a bit left out. Well, that's never going to see the light of day because maybe there's a period that needs to happen in there or something. Something like that, maybe. That's the only thing I've noticed.
Yeah, I think dates might be better than books in a lot of ways for that sort of thing. So classical and chariot from date X to date Y, and definitely if you're doing it with dates, don't restrict the allies because Richard's done all the work of making sure the allies are valid for that date. So rely on that historical research rather than just trying to fit things into a theme because it's in a particular PDF in the way it's been organised in the first place.
Here's a theme I've been thinking on, which you may all decide is completely ridiculous. So you're limited to having 6 professional cards worth of professional general, or 7 instinctive. Can't mix and match. If you're only professional generals, your maximum is 6. If you've got nothing but instinctive, you can have 7 cards.
That's it. So if you were professional generals, you could have 3 mediocre generals,
yes,
or 2 competent.
Yes, or a talented and a mediocre, if you like. I mean,
and not a legendary at all.
No.
Or just a legendary?
Yes, actually, you could, couldn't you? You could pick just a legendary. I'm not
I
sure.
think you have to have
you're
two
limited to two
generals,
generals, aren't you?
Yeah.
I might be willing to make it. I might make a special exception if you did that to allow you to have.
You could have a one-card general.
No. You could just have you could just take the legendary general if you wanted.
It's still play with full-size armies.
Yeah. I mean, you could reduce the points a little bit, but it almost spoils the theme to do so.
Mm-hmm.
The idea is to get you to pick an army that's going to have to work on a really stingy number of cards.
It would lean a bit towards the super elite armies, wouldn't it? I think something like a Spartans with only where you can get like 5 or 6 units in most of your points.
Yeah, that would be my concern. One thing I have played with Pacto is actually, and this is a rule change, so I'm not recommending this, is just to remove the restriction on how many units a general can actually move as a block move. But I think if you did that and then played with your very restricted command, that actually might work. Because you're running the risk of yes, you could move 5 units in one block, but the mediocre has to get the cards to be able to do it.
And that'd be all he could do. So that's your 2 cards used.
I'm thinking something with 8 fully armored elephants.
Ghaznavid or Muslim Indian sultanates.
Yeah, and they're like professional generals. So there's a talented and the mediocre, and just bash forward with the elephants.
Well, I think I might therefore argue there is no such thing as a bad theme.
As we're already thinking about your theme, and we've all agreed, well, we could do it like this.
Right.
Yeah. The bad theme would be a theme where everybody chooses a single army because it's far better than all the rest. That would be the only criteria really for a bad theme, and that's quite hard to do in Meg.
I think the only time I've encountered that, I think, was one year at Campaign, which traditionally has quite restricted pools. I think it might have been the last one where it was, I can't remember exactly what the theme was, but basically Serbian Empire was the army of choice.
Yeah.
There was, it's difficult to do low number army choices sometimes, and sometimes it can be the army that an army just pops out, somebody spots something in it, goes, "Ooh, hello," and it sort of gets out and everybody picks it, sort of thing. I must admit, I have to say, despite bringing this up, while I've had themes I prefer to other themes, it's often down to historical bias. It's a period I like, or I can use an army I really like, so I just get a bit more out of the competition. I think, Paul, I don't think I've been to one and thought that was a rubbish theme. I hope we never see that again.
Yeah. The other criteria for a bad theme would be a selection of armies that nobody has.
Nobody turns up.
But hopefully, if you can avoid those 2 issues, it seems to me that actually there's an awful lot of options available.
I think you want variation, don't you? I mean, that's kind of basically the first point Richard made, really. But you need to have enough variation. You need to turn up going. If you're going to look at all the lists and think only one type of thing's ever going to turn up, you end up playing 4 games that are very, very similar. It's less fun. I mean, you can still have good fun doing it, but it's less fun. You want a bit of variation, so you can, complain about the draw. At least you've got something to blame when you do badly.
I must admit, I would like to see a Greece and Persian theme, because that seems to be an area that seems to have got a bit neglected for reasons I don't really quite understand. But
excellent. I shall bring Sassanid Persian then. Oh, that isn't quite what you were on about.
That wasn't what I meant, and you know it.
How would you do that?
I think that actually links back to what Graham was on about earlier. That period, like the Achaemenid Persians seem to drop out of everything.
It's because it probably starts with the Median Empire, which is in the Assyrian Babylon book,
Yeah.
and it goes through to sort of probably Age of Alexander or something, and then the problem is that those armies are scattered amongst the 8 classical list sets. So there's a bit of work involved in identifying the armies, but yeah. Anyway, it's one of my things that I'm working on.
Excellent.
It'd be one I'd be interested in, because funny enough, Mr. Cummings mentioned an author, Tom Holland, who'd written a book called Persian Fire,
So
which I've just finished listening to actually on Audible. But fascinating stuff. So that kind of campaign is actually in my mind at the moment. And, I'm already planning an army which will no doubt have chuckles from everybody. But so if there's an opportunity to field something insane legitimately, I'm all for it.
I could feel myself being dragged to do a later Achaemenid Persian in Zyston figures, partly because it's just a bit naff, or shall we say challenging.
Well, it is an
Special,
army
isn't
that's
it?
famous for losing, isn't it? So it's
Exactly. I've always had this thing about preferring end of empires to beginnings. So you know that crushed under the hooves of Alexander the Great is that. Okay, guys, we've been going on quite a bit of time now, and hopefully everybody's found it interesting. I just thought I'd ask Paul Cummings just to do one last thing. I think I mentioned it to him previously. Hopefully, is there's been a bit of chat outside of some of the other normal communications. I think it was on a WhatsApp chat about themes, about competitions, and one of the things that was mentioned was, nearly all of our competitions are 2-dayers. Some people don't have the time, and maybe getting some 1-day competitions into the calendar to mix it up a bit. So maybe slotting in between what are almost one a month 2-day competitions. Okay, we'll ignore October this year, which just got a bit weird when saying that. But in general, we've generally had, if you like, 1-2-dayer every month for most months. Slot some 1-dayers in between. Provides a different format. Opportunities for people who can't make the other ones. Opportunities for people who can't make 2 days. And I think Paul had some ideas, or had collated some ideas. So Paul, just to float it to the wider community who listen to the podcast, hopefully.
yeah, well, the cunning plan as far as it went was try and get more 1-day competitions and in more places, so that people don't have to travel so far, what with the cost of petrol and all that sort of thing. Obviously, the problem with 1-day competitions is you don't get as many games in, you don't get the sort of sorting hats effect of enough rounds of competition to work out who is the greatest, and you obviously don't play as many different people. So as a organizational thing, the idea was try and come up with a league structure where we could try and organize it so that if you have these 1-day competitions, you try and plan it so you're playing against different people who you haven't played at previous competitions, but we can collate all the scores, all the matchups to have a championship over time, so a league in effect. So some thoughts on making regional divisions in a NFL sort of style, and see where we get to. I think some of the levels of complexity that we could add in are not necessary. I think in the first instance, an idea of organising a few 1-day competitions, collating results from different places, and having that as a league is pretty much where we want to start. I think key for me, from terms of organisation, is too many things would mean that it'll probably kill even my ability to keep track of all the data to begin with, without having other people maintain the records. But it's better if it's all in one place and keep it all organised. There were some thoughts about having individual games being able to add to the league, but again, in the first pop, I think that'll just make it more complicated for less benefit. So what I'm really looking at is I'm hoping I'll try and organise at least the first couple of games, or first couple of days, organise them at least over the summer, and see what happens, and see if we can get people to sign up. Obviously, it won't need signing up in advance. It's turn up to a competition, which will be a couple of games or maybe 3 games in a day, and chuck the results in. And if it looks like it's going to work, that would be great. So any suggestions of how to improve on that first thoughts, gratefully accepted. In fact, obviously, I think the easiest thing would be to set up a new channel in our nice new Discord server we've got sitting there, which has been surprisingly popular since we got that going. So we get some ideas in there and start bashing things around.
Sounds like a good idea. I think that's possibly worth emphasising, just because words like league and are being thrown around doesn't mean it's some sort of super competitive playing for your houses sort of thing. That's just a label.
Yeah, the reason for describing it as a league is just so that we can try and, well, people like to see who's coming out top. Not super competitive, but no more competitive than any normal competition. It's more a matter of keeping records to try and make it easier to play other people, so that if you only got 2 or 3 games in a day and you've got 10 players, you're only going to, you quite easily end up playing the same people every time. So bit of record keeping, bit of organising, try and make it so you play different people each time. That's the core of it, I think.
And I mean, we had was it one of Ray's themes that ended up being? Sorry, excuse my hound in the back.
Yeah.
Was it one of Ray's themes that ended up being split over
Armageddon?
Geographic Armageddon. So even if we did 1-day events, we could actually set up a theme with, as you say, regional leagues, so we can all be participating in the same thing. Apparently, my dog will be playing. I'll shut up now.
Strong opinions there.
Yeah, but perhaps they want to join in the league.
Yeah.
Saying, Dad, buy me an army.
Probably get better cards and dice than I do.
But yeah, Matt, I think you're exactly right. Having those same things happening in lots of different places at the same time. No, I mean, that was really good. I really enjoyed that Armageddon. For that, it was an oddity because it was straight after the worst of COVID, and we were doing all sorts of pods and things to try and make it work.
Yeah.
But it had some useful ideas, and that effectively became a sort of a league with different divisions happening and then mixing. And I think that was quite an interesting idea.
Yeah, I think it wouldn't necessarily have to be different locations playing on the same day either, would it?
I think it have to be is a strong for anything in this concept. I think the idea really is to make it as open as possible, easy as possible, and basically make it as easy for many people to get as many games as possible. Really,
I think
if the idea was to get 3 games in a day, would it be worth thinking about a lower points value?
Oh, I think definitely.
If you're aiming for 3 games, yeah, unless you play like I do.
I think a couple of things. I think firstly, as you say, I think I would definitely want to keep all the games in it involved in the competition days, because I think that's fine. You turn up to a competition, you turn up with your competition head on, and you've usually got your head into a space of, okay, it's a competition, I'm going to lose or whatever. If it was an ongoing thing and people's friendly games suddenly become their one league game, you could just get a bit you put pressure on a game. You play someone 5 times, you put pressure on a friendly game. It doesn't feel right for me in the same way. I think if I was going to organise, I think the best thing to do is pick 2 or 3 different places and say you're each going to run 2 1-day events, and people turn up for that, and then just collate the results, and that'll probably be a good way to start it, and then set actually a 2002 variant or whatever, and then see how that goes.
That's a good plan. It's a good plan.
Yeah, and in the end, it's an excuse for playing more games, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly that.
Yeah, I would. No compulsion, all voluntary.
We will force you to play games.
Yes, definitely not. This is all. As is.
So if I could claim that you forced me to buy the lead to play the games, that would be fine.
That just sounds as an excuse to your wife, Matt. Is this for you trying to sneak something past Joe?
Pretty much, yes.
I had no choice. They made me do it.
It was peer pressure.
It was.
Anyway.
Okay, folks. I think we've been going near enough a couple of hours now, so that I think it's been really good. So Richard's already had to leave us, I noticed. So, because we past the time we'd booked for it. Just to say thank you very much to everybody. Thank you to our 3 guests. We might even have you back at some point.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
And I think certainly if the you know, if we can get the league thing has traction, if people want to do that, might have Paul back just to reiterate what he just said, or just give us an update on how it's going, so that people know it's there. Sort of watch this space, really, isn't it? I think on that point.
So. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, thank you all very much. That's been great. Look forward to seeing you across the table sometime. And if not across the table, in the pub before or afterwards. Thank you very much, and good night, Megas.